and then been shot down by apparently a pretty coordinated effort, NATO effort, not just Polish effort, inside the country of Poland?
Well, I think there are three possibilities here. One is that the Russians actually targeted Poland. They were sending us a message, us meaning the West. That's one possibility. Another possibility is these drones just veered off course. And given the fact that the attack on the evening that the drones wandered into Poland, the attack inside of Ukraine was so huge, it is possible that a couple drones did wander into Polish airspace. And then the third possibility is that the Ukrainians jammed a number of those drones, sent them off course in a haywire kind of fashion, and they ended up going into Belarus and then into Poland, or going directly into Poland. It seems to me, Danny, that it's hard to believe that the Russians purposely attacked Poland with drones. It just doesn't make any sense at all. To me, the Russians have no interest in provoking NATO at this point in time. I think it's probably either those drones just naturally went off course on their own, or they were jammed and they went into Poland, or they went into Belarus and then into Poland. So I think it's either the second or third alternative. But as you pointed out, these were not armed drones. They didn't kill anybody. They didn't do significant damage by any means. But what's happening here, of course, is the West is blowing this up into a major event, all for the purpose of demonizing the Russians and mobilizing the West against Russia.
And we've certainly seen a lot of that. I'm going to have some examples to show, because like this idea in Washington politics is never let a crisis go to waste. Always use it to your advantage. I think that applies in this area as well. Whether it was intentional or not, there's no doubt that many in Europe and Ukraine have seized upon this opportunity to, shall we say, put forward their favorite views and to give them a little bit more life. More on that in a second. But before we get there, I want to talk about, you mentioned that this incursion came as part of a over 400 air attack into Ukraine from the Russian side, which does continue on a near nightly attack, anywhere from 300 to 400 up to 800, as happened just a few days ago. And Ukraine simply doesn't have the capacity to shoot down everything that's coming in. And so every night there's lots and lots of destruction across the board throughout the depth of Ukraine. Meanwhile, as it always seems to be the case, it's along the front lines of where the real issues are. And just a few days ago, Alexander Syrskyi, the commanding general for the Ukraine side, admitted that Russia has a threefold advantage on the front line, and in some areas it can prevail by 4 to 6 times. Now, in terms of where this war is going, what does that tell you?
Well, I'll tell you, Danny, when you sort of look at the various indicators that determine who wins in those battles up on the front line, there are three things that I look at. Number one is the overall ratio of forces on the two sides. And when General Syrskyi, who is the Ukrainian commander, tells us that the Russians overall outnumber the Ukrainians 3-1, and at some critical points along the front line, the Ukrainians are outnumbered 6-1, they're really in deep trouble. Furthermore, there's all sorts of evidence coming from the Ukrainian side that they do not have enough forces to cover the front line. In other words, you have this huge front line that has to be covered by the Ukrainian army. And they have so few troops at this point in time that there are big gaps, there are open spaces in the front line. And when the Russians discover those front lines, they invariably make a penetration. So this is a huge problem. And then the third indicator that I look at has to do with what the percentage of available manpower is in the various brigades that are fighting on the Ukrainian side. And Putin has recently said, and I think there's no reason to doubt it, that the Ukrainian brigades are operating at about 50%, with about 50% of their available or their needed manpower, not their available manpower. They have about 50%. That's what's available of the needed manpower. These are brigades that are barely capable of functioning. When you've been attrited down to the point where your brigades only have 50% of the required manpower, you're in real trouble. So I would say that if you look at these three key indicators, the overall force ratio, the force to space ratios, and the available amount of manpower inside each brigade, the Ukrainians are in desperate straits.
Yeah, and if anybody doesn't said, "Oh well, Vladimir Putin, of course he's going to exaggerate everything, and he's going to make it sound worse than it is." Well, don't take his word for it. Take the brigade commander of the 44th Brigade, who just, I believe this was released yesterday, on Ukrainian media. You see, he went public and talked about this. We don't have the people to cover every meter of the front. So that really validates exactly what you just said there. And you also got to imagine, if it seems pretty amazing to me that he's taken the risk of publicly saying this, because heretofore that's like been a kind of a no-no. You just don't talk openly about some of your weaknesses. But what does that tell you that he's willing to go public with this?
I think he's probably trying to send a signal to the higher echelons that they need more manpower and that they're in desperate straits and that something has to be done. And I think that would be the purpose of advertising this fact. And I would assume that the Russians know what these numbers look like anyway, and the Russians understand this problem that the Ukrainians have. So it's not like he's signaling classified information to the Russians. I think he's trying to tell people up top that we need more troops up on the front line. But the problem, as we know very well, is that the Ukrainians are incapable, for a variety of reasons, in raising the manpower that's necessary to replace those men who have been lost in the various brigades on the front line, and to just beef up the frontline forces to the point where they can cover the entire front, and they have something that approximates a 1-to-1 ratio with the Russians.
And even that might not be enough to slow it down, but they certainly want to get closer. The problem is, also according to Ukrainian sources here in the last week or so, is that they report that the Russian side continues to mobilize about 35,000 people per month, and they don't lose a fraction of that. Maybe somewhere around, by some estimates, 3,000 or 4,000 total that are killed and wounded per month on the Russian side, much lower than what is commonly ascribed to. But that tells you that the Russian military is growing, and so they don't have a problem plug in the gaps of the places they want to have this 6-to-1 advantage at the key areas, et cetera. And one has to wonder, how much longer can those dynamics exist without there being some kind of a break in the Ukraine line?
Yeah, there's two things I think going on with the Russians. Number one is that they are actually very good at raising large number of troops. It's the opposite of the situation that you see with the Ukrainians. But the other thing is the Russians employ their troops on the front line in very cautious ways. It's the reason that they have not captured a lot of territory. A lot of people in the West like to argue that the Russians are launching frontal attacks. It's like throwing troops into a meat grinder, and huge numbers of Russian soldiers are dying, many more than Ukrainian soldiers. This is simply not true. If you look at what's happening, and quite a few Ukrainian commanders comment on this, the Russians are actually remarkably cautious. They use small clusters of infantry to sort of feel out where the Ukrainian forces are. And then they use firepower of one sort or another. It could be artillery, it could be drones, it could be glide bombs, all to attack the infantry, the Ukrainian infantry that's been ferreted out by the Russian infantry. So the Russians are not suffering great casualties on the front lines. Of course, they're suffering some casualties. This is a war of attrition. Both sides have lots of firepower, and lots of people are going to die. But the Russian casualty levels are just not very high. And when you marry that to the fact that they're mobilizing huge numbers of troops, you come to realize that they have a large reserve of forces they can deploy at some point in time. They've not chosen to do that. But one has the sense that at some point the Russians are going to launch a massive offensive where they bring together many of those reserve forces that they've raised over the past 2 years and try to break through in a major way to the Dnieper River. Now, that might not happen. Who knows for sure what the Russians are thinking? But they, I think, have a significant advantage in manpower. Excuse me. And you would expect them to take advantage of that at some point.
And you're speaking about the higher ups. You said a second ago that you think maybe that 44th Brigade commander was making that public statement to signal to the higher ups that, hey, we need more troops. Sirski also made the public comment that they're outgunned, outmanned 3-1 or 6-1, depending on where you're talking about there. Again, probably signaling to operational that we don't have enough troops. So one would imagine that then Zelensky would be really focused on doing whatever he could to get more troops. But instead, he seems to be taking advantage of this opportunity with the drone strike or the veered off drones, whatever, that went into Poland and were shot down to get more money and to get more equipment, etc., thinking that that's actually the stand. Here's how he put it.
How to prevent the war from expanding and how to stop Russian steps from escalating. Joint forces are absolutely enough for this. Today, there is a lot of international work on this, from all the leaders. I thank every leader who supported Poland, who supports Ukraine, and who understands the threat to the countries on the eastern flank, and that it is drones that Russia is now making the main tool for murder and destabilization. However, the missile threat does not decrease. Russia continues to build its military industry. We talked about all this with the leaders of Europe, specifically with the Prime Minister of Poland, Tusk, the Prime Minister of the UK, Starmer, the head of the Italian government, Meloni, and the NATO Secretary General, Rutte. It is important to continue to coordinate.
So he's acknowledging not just the manpower is growing on the Russian side. He brought into the situation that the Russian military industrial capacity continues to expand. Not even that it's already over, but that it's getting larger. It hasn't even plateaued yet. So why does he then think that this joint force, and I don't know what he's talking about joint force, because I haven't seen anybody else talking about sending troops in to fight with Ukraine. So I'm not sure where he's going with this.
Well, he's just trying to keep the West